In the secluded village of Mistwood, Ethan, a shunned hermit known as Old Whisper, lived a life cloaked in mystery, mocked for his solitude and dismissed as a nobody. Ethan was secretly the guardian of the Emerald Codex, an ancient artifact of unimaginable wisdom. When illness left him frail and vulnerable, his estranged daughter Clara and her greedy husband Victor returned, not to care for him, but to uncover his rumored treasure. Guided by a mysterious traveler named Lucas, they ventured into the cursed forest surrounding the village, where their true natures were laid bare. Greed, regret, and guilt collided as the forest revealed their darkest truths, forcing them to confront what truly mattered. In the end, Ethan's legacy was not one of gold or power, but of kindness, sacrifice, and the enduring lesson that true wealth lies in the bonds we share. Who was Ethan really? And what secrets did the forest hold? This tale of redemption, transformation, and hidden treasures will leave you wondering, what would the forest reveal about you? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories like this one. Your next adventure is just a click away. Nestled deep in the shadow of the towering emerald peaks, where mist wove through ancient trees like whispers of forgotten tales, there lay a village as old as time itself. The villagers called it Mistwood, a place cloaked in mystery and bound by superstitions that ebbed and flowed like the restless rivers nearby. Here, life moved with the rhythm of nature, the crackling of hearths, the rustle of leaves, and the distant howls of wolves that seemed to carry warnings in the stillness of the night. Mistwood was a village of stories. Every stone in the cobbled streets bore witness to whispered rumors, and every corner of the village square echoed with tales spun by the elderly under the flickering glow of lanterns. But among all these tales, none was more peculiar than the story of Ethan, Old Whisper, as they mockingly called him. Ethan was a man of solitude. His small, weather-beaten cottage sat on the edge of the village, where the forest's grasp was strongest. Twisted vines and gnarled roots encroached upon his home, as though nature itself sought to claim him. Few dared to approach, not out of fear for their safety, but for the strange aura that seemed to envelop the place. It was said that Ethan had lived there longer than anyone could remember, always alone, always quiet, as if carrying a burden too heavy for words. The villagers did not hate Ethan. They pitied and ridiculed him in equal measure. He was an oddity, a recluse who rarely ventured beyond the edges of Mistwood. When he did, his presence was met with stifled laughter or sideways glances. His clothes, patched and frayed, hung loosely on his wiry frame, and his face, weathered by years of toil, was shadowed by a beard that seemed as wild as the forest itself. But it was his eyes, depth, dark and unfathomable, that unnerved those who met his gaze. They seemed to hold secrets that no one dared uncover, secrets that had kept him apart from the village for decades. The villagers whispered about Ethan's peculiar habits. He spoke to no one unless spoken to, and rarely attended gatherings or market days. When he did, it was to barter simple wooden carvings for food or supplies. These carvings, intricate and otherworldly, bore designs no one in the village could replicate, twisting vines, ancient symbols, and scenes of faraway lands. Some claimed he had learned these skills from a time before he came to Mistwood, but no one knew for sure. Ethan never spoke of his past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, a group of children dared each other to venture near Ethan's cottage. They crept through the undergrowth, their whispers barely audible, over the chirping of crickets. From the shadows, they saw him sitting on the steps of his porch, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. He was whittling a piece of wood, the shavings falling to his feet like snowflakes, falling to his feet like snowflakes. The children held their breath, expecting him to notice their presence, but he remained absorbed in his work, his movements steady and precise. When one child stumbled and let out a yelp, Ethan paused. Slowly, he turned his head toward the sound, his eyes piercing through the darkness. The children fled, their laughter tinged with fear, but Ethan made no move to follow. As they returned to the village, the children recounted their tale with wide eyes and trembling voices. "He looked right at me," one exclaimed. "It was like he could see into my soul." The adults chuckled, dismissing the story as the product of youthful imaginations. Yet deep down, they too felt the unease that Ethan's presence often brought. Despite his isolation, Ethan was not cruel. On rare occasions, when someone needed help, be it a broken tool or a lost child, he would lend his hand without hesitation. His strength and skill were unmatched. He could fell a tree in a single afternoon or carve a likeness of a person so precise it seemed to breathe. Yet, for all his quiet acts of kindness, the villagers kept their distance, unwilling to embrace the man who seemed more a shadow than flesh and blood. The elders spoke of a time when Ethan was different, a time before the whispers and the solitude. "He came here as a young man," they would say, their voices low as if the forest itself might overhear. "Strong, full of life, and with a fire in his eyes. But something happened, something that took the fire away." When pressed for details, they would shake their heads and fall silent, unwilling or unable to say more. As the years passed, Ethan's story became more legend than truth. Rumors swirled about his connection to the cursed forest. Some claimed he had struck a bargain with the spirits that dwelled there, trading his soul for the skill to carve those hauntingly beautiful designs. Others believed he guarded a treasure hidden deep within the woods, a treasure so great it had cost him everything to keep it safe. But Ethan himself offered no answers, and the villagers, content with their tales, never dared to ask. One day, a traveling merchant passing through Mistwood stopped to speak with Ethan. The two men stood at the edge of the village, their voices too low for anyone to hear. The merchant, a man known for his boisterous laughter and quick wit, left Mistwood that evening without a word, his face pale and his hands trembling. When questioned, he only muttered, "There's more to that man than meets the eye," before hastily departing. The incident added fuel to the villagers' speculations, but Ethan, as always, remained silent. Seasons came and went, and Ethan's life continued its solitary rhythm. The village grew accustomed to his presence, though they never truly accepted him. For them, he was an enigma, a man whose life seemed to exist on the periphery of their own. But for Ethan, the isolation was a choice, a necessity. He carried a burden that none of them could comprehend, a burden that had defined his existence for as long as he could remember. On stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain lashed against the rooftops, some villagers claimed they could hear Ethan's voice carried on the wind, It was not the voice of a man crying out in pain or anger, but a low melodic hum, like a low melodic hum, like a low melodic hum, like a lullaby from a distant past. Those brave enough to listen closely said it was a song filled with sorrow and longing, a song that seemed to call out to something or someone beyond the forest's edge. Despite their curiosity, no one dared venture near Ethan's home on those nights. The fear of what they might find, or worse, what they might not, kept them at bay, and so Ethan remained a mystery, a man out of reach, both physically and emotionally. The villagers continued their lives, weaving tales about the hermit at the edge of the woods, never realizing how intertwined his fate was with their own. Ethan's silence was his shield, his refuge. But deep within, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth he had so carefully guarded would come to light. The forest had been his sanctuary, his prison, and his confidant. It had protected him and watched over him, but it had also borne witness to his deepest regrets and his greatest fears. As the moon rose high over Mistwood, casting its silvery glow upon the village, Ethan sat alone in his cottage, his hands resting on the worn wood of his chair. The flickering light of a single candle illuminated his face, and for a moment his eyes seemed to glisten with unshed tears. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its mournful cry echoing through the night. Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the sound. He knew the time was coming. The secrets he had buried, the truths he had hidden, they would not remain in the shadows forever. The first signs of Ethan's decline were subtle, barely noticed by the villagers who passed his cottage on their way to the forest. The man who had once moved with the quiet efficiency of a predator in his domain now seemed slower, his steps heavier. His visits to the village grew less frequent, and when he did appear, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. The sharp glint in his eyes, once likened to the piercing gaze of a hawk, now seemed dimmed, as if the fire within him were flickering, struggling to stay alive. The villagers, as always, were quick to gossip. Perhaps the curse of the forest has finally caught him, they murmured. The old hermit can't escape forever. Some speculated that he was paying the price for years of isolation, while others believed the spirits of the forest were exacting their toll for the secrets he harbored. But while they whispered, none dared approach to offer aid. Ethan's life was a riddle they were content to leave unsolved. In the solitude of his cottage, Ethan felt the creeping tendrils of illness tighten their grip. It began with a numbness in his hands, an ache in his back that refused to abate. Then came the stiffness in his legs, as though the earth itself sought to root him in place. As though the earth itself sought to root him in place. Each day, the simplest tasks grew more laborious. Carving the wood he had once transformed with ease now left his hands trembling, the intricate patterns he had mastered devolving into jagged scratches. One morning, Ethan awoke and found himself unable to rise from his bed. His body felt like lead, his limbs unresponsive. The realization struck him with a force greater than any blow. He was no longer the man he had been, the man who could navigate the dense forest with the grace of a shadow. He was trapped, not by the wilderness, but by his own failing body. Days turned to weeks, and the isolation that had once been his solace became his torment. Unable to leave his home, Ethan subsisted on the meager supplies he had managed to store. The ache of hunger gnawed at him, but worse was the despair that seeped into his mind. He had always been alone, but now he was powerless. a prisoner within the walls of his own making. It was during one such moment of despair that a familiar voice shattered the stillness. "Father," it was a word Ethan had not heard in years, not since Clara, his only daughter, had left Mistwood with her husband, Victor. The memory of their departure was etched into his mind, their promises of returning soon, the fleeting embrace Clara had given him before vanishing into the world beyond the forest. And yet, here she was. Claire stood in the doorway of his cottage, her once innocent face now hardened by years away. Behind her, Victor loomed, his presence filling the small space like a shadow. His sharp suit and polished boots seemed out of place in the rustic simplicity of Mistwood, a glaring reminder of the life they had chosen over Ethan. "We heard you were unwell," Clara said, her voice carefully measured. She stepped inside, her eyes darting around the cottage as though searching for something. "We thought it best to come and see you." Ethan managed a faint smile, though it did little to mask the suspicion rising within him. He had no reason to trust them, not after years of silence. Yet he lacked the strength to question their motives. Instead, he nodded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's good to see you." Victor wasted no time. "You've lived here alone for too long, old man," he said, his tone carrying a hint of derision masked as concern. "Let us take care of you. Clara and I have done well for ourselves in the city. We can provide for you now." Clara moved closer, placing a hand on Ethan's frail arm. "You shouldn't be alone, father. Let us help." Despite the warmth of her words, Ethan saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes. He had seen that look before in men who ventured into the forest seeking gold or timber, their greed consuming them. Clara and Victor were no different. They had come not out of love or duty, but for something else entirely. Still, Ethan said nothing. He allowed them to move him from his bed, to bring him food and water. Their gestures of care were mechanical, perfunctory, as if fulfilling a role they had no desire to play. At night, Ethan lay awake, listening to their hushed conversations. They spoke of the forest, of the rumors that had swirled around him for years. "There must be something here," Victor said one night, his voice a low growl. "The villagers say he guards a treasure. We need to find it." Clara's response was quieter, but no less damning. "We will. He's too weak to stop us now." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on him. He had once believed that blood was thicker than water, that family would stand by him when all else failed. But now, as he lay in the dim light of his cottage, he realized how deeply he had been mistaken. The days that followed were a test of endurance. Clara and Victor's facade of kindness began to crack. Their patience wore thin as they found nothing of value within the cottage. Victor's frustration grew, his words sharper, his movements more forceful. Clara, too, became distant, her visits to Ethan's bedside increasingly brief. They began leaving him for hours at a time, wandering into the forest with the hope of uncovering the secrets they believed were hidden there. The villagers, ever watchful, noticed the change. They saw Clara and Victor prowling the edges of the forest, their faces drawn with greed. They saw the flicker of lanterns in Ethan's cottage at odd hours, the hushed arguments that carried through the night. Rumors spread like wildfire. "They've come for his treasure," the villagers said. "They'll bleed him dry before they leave." Despite their curiosity, None of the villagers intervened. Ethan's life had always been a spectacle, a source of entertainment for those who thrived on gossip. And now, in his most vulnerable state, he was little more than a tragedy unfolding before their eyes. As the days dragged on, Ethan grew weaker. His body, once a vessel of strength, now seemed to betray him with every breath. Yet, even in his frailty, his mind remained sharp. He watched Clara and Victor, their movements, their words, their growing desperation. He listened to the villagers' whispers, the pity and scorn that filled their voices, and he waited. For Ethan knew something they did not. The forest that surrounded them, the forest that had been both his sanctuary and his prison, was not a place to be trifled with. It held secrets that could not be taken by force, treasures that demanded more than greed to be uncovered. And though he had guarded these secrets for years, he understood that the time was nearing when they would come to light. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the sky, Clara and Victor returned from the forest, their faces flushed with frustration. "It's hopeless," Victor snarled. "The old man has nothing. We're wasting our time." Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Ethan's still form. For a moment, there was a glimmer of doubt, a shadow of guilt, but it was fleeting. "There's something here," she said softly. "We just haven't found it yet." Ethan closed his eyes, feigning sleep. His heart, though heavy with sorrow, held a quiet resolve. They could take what little strength he had left, strip him of his dignity, but they would never find what they sought, not without facing the trials that lay ahead. The forest would see to that. As the days stretched into weeks, Mistwood settled into an uneasy rhythm. The presence of Clara and Victor in Ethan's cottage was an unwelcome disturbance, their motives transparent to all who watched. Rumors of their greed festered among the villagers, accompanied by hushed murmurs about Ethan's failing health. It was in this charged atmosphere that an unfamiliar figure appeared, altering the course of events with his unexpected arrival. The stranger came just as the sun broke through the morning mist, casting golden beams across the forest. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with an air of quiet confidence that commanded attention. His hair, dark as the shadows of the woods, framed a face marked by years of travel. His cloak, made of sturdy fabric, was adorned with intricate patterns that hinted at distant lands. Over his shoulder, he carried a satchel that jingled faintly with every step. The villagers noticed him immediately. Outsiders were rare in Mistwood, rarer still those who carried themselves like they belonged. A few brave souls approached, their curiosity outweighing their caution. The stranger greeted them with a nod and a warm smile, his voice rich and deep as he introduced himself. "My name is Lucas," he said simply, offering no further explanation. It wasn't long before the villagers began pressing him with questions. Why had he come? Was he lost? Did he know of the village's reputation? The curse of the forest? Lucas responded with polite evasion, his answers vague but not dismissive. His presence, though mysterious, exuded a calm reassurance that put them at ease. As he moved through the village, Lucas's gaze seemed to linger on the details others might overlook: the weathered stones of the square, the twisting branches of the ancient oak that stood sentinel near the forest's edge. When his eyes fell upon Ethan's cottage, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, so brief it might have been imagined. Without hesitation, Lucas made his way toward the small house, his steps purposeful. The villagers watched with bated breath, their whispers trailing him like leaves caught in the wind. Clara, hearing the commotion from within the cottage, stepped outside just as Lucas reached the door. "Who are you?" she demanded, her tone sharp with suspicion. Victor appeared behind her, his imposing frame filling the doorway, his expression one of barely concealed irritation. Lucas inclined his head in greeting. Clara hesitated, taken aback by the stranger's familiarity. "My father isn't well," she replied, her voice faltering. "He doesn't take visitors." Lucas's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Nevertheless, I must speak with him." Before Clara could object further, a faint sound came from within the cottage, a rasping voice, weak yet insistent. "Let him in." The command was unmistakable, and Clara reluctantly stepped aside, her unease palpable. Lucas entered the dimly lit room, his presence seeming to fill the space. Ethan lay on the narrow bed, his frail body propped up by thin pillows. His face was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes, those piercing eyes, had regained some of their former fire. "Lucas," Ethan said, a hint of relief in his voice. "It's been a long time." Lucas approached the bed, lowering himself to one knee, so he was eye level with the older man. "Too long, old friend." He replied softly, "You look worse for wear." Ethan managed a faint smile. "You don't look much better." The exchange, though brief, spoke volumes. It was clear to Claire and Victor that this man was no stranger to Ethan. Their unease deepened, their curiosity sharpened to a knife's edge. Clara lingered near the doorway, straining to catch every word, while Victor loomed in the background, his expression dark and unreadable. "I feared you wouldn't come," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible. Lucas's expression softened. "You knew I would. The forest made sure of it." At the mention of the forest, Clara stiffened. She exchanged a glance with Victor, her unease giving way to a flicker of greed. They had been searching for answers, for any clue to the treasure they believed Ethan was hiding, and now it seemed the stranger might hold the key. "What's this about the forest?" Victor interjected, his voice cutting through the moment like a blade. He stepped forward, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the bed. "If there's something we should know, now's the time to share it." Lucas's gaze flicked to Victor, cool and assessing. "The forest holds many secrets," he said evenly, "but it reveals them only to those who prove worthy." Victor scoffed, crossing his arms. "And what does that mean?" "It means," Lucas replied, his tone measured, "that greed and selfishness will get you nowhere." Victor's jaw tightened, but before he could retort, Ethan raised a trembling hand. "Enough," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. He turned to Lucas. "Tell them what they need to know." Lucas hesitated, his gaze searching Ethan's face. After a moment, he nodded. Rising to his full height, he turned to address Clara and Victor. "Your father is not the man you think he is," Lucas began. "For years, he has guarded a secret, a burden he has carried not for himself, but for the good of others. Deep within the forest lies the Emerald Codex, an artifact of unimaginable power and wisdom. It is said to hold the answers to questions humanity has long sought, but it does not reveal easily. The forest protects it, testing those who seek it, weeding out the unworthy. Clara's eyes widened, her mind racing. And my father, he knows where it is. Lucas inclined his head. He is its guardian, chosen by the forest itself. But his role was not to claim the codex for himself. It was to ensure it remained hidden, safe from those who would misuse it. Victor laughed bitterly. Safe. Hidden. He's lying here, half dead. What good is this treasure if he can't even use it? Lucas's gaze hardened. The codex is not treasure in the way you imagine. It is not gold or jewels. Its value cannot be measured in wealth, but in knowledge and understanding, and it does not belong to him, nor to you. Clara took a step forward, her expression a mix of awe and determination. If he's the guardian, then he can lead us to it. Ethan's laugh was a dry rasp. The forest doesn't work that way, Clara. It reveals itself only to those who are worthy, and worthiness cannot be fake. Lucas placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his voice low. You've done your part, old friend. Rest now. I'll guide those who wish to try. The tension in the room was palpable as Lucas straightened, his gaze sweeping over Clara and Victor. But know this, he said, his voice firm. The forest will test you. It will see into your heart, your intentions. If greed drives you, it will find you unworthy. If you are not prepared to face your truest self, you would be wise to turn back. Clara and Victor exchanged a glance, their greed momentarily tempered by a flicker of doubt. But the lure of the codex was too great, the promise of what it might offer too enticing to ignore. We'll go, Clara said, her voice resolute. We'll prove ourselves. Lucas regarded her for a long moment before nodding. Then, prepare yourselves. The forest does not wait. As he turned to leave, Ethan's voice stopped him. The younger man paused, glancing back. Keep them safe, Ethan said, his eyes weary but hopeful, even if they don't deserve it. Lucas's expression softened. I'll do my best. With that, he stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. Inside the cottage, silence fell, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Ethan closed his eyes, his thoughts heavy. The forest would soon reveal the truth, not only to his family, but to the village that had watched from the sidelines. And in its shadows, the true nature of those who entered would be laid bare. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted trees forming a wall of shadow and mystery. The morning sun cast long beams of light through the canopy, but they barely pierced the thick veil of mist that clung to the ground. Clara, Victor, and a small group of curious villagers stood at its edge, their faces pale with uncertainty. Lucas stood before them, calm and composed, his presence a steady anchor against the unease that rippled through the group. The forest knows you now, Lucas said, his voice low but firm. It watches your every step, weighs your every thought. You cannot deceive it, and you cannot force its secrets. And you cannot force its secrets. If you proceed, you must be prepared to face yourselves. Victor scoffed, his bravado masking the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Spare me the theatrics. It's just a forest. Lucas met his gaze with a look that silenced any further protest. If you think it's just a forest, you'll be the first to fall. With that, Lucas turned and stepped into the mist, his movements sure and unhesitating. Clara hesitated for a moment, casting a glance at Victor before following. The villagers trailed behind, their footsteps faltering as the shadows of the forest swallowed them whole. The air grew colder with each step, the sounds of the village fading into an eerie stillness. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches twisting like grasping hands. The group walked in silence, their breaths visible in the chilled air. It was not long before the first test came. The path ahead forked into three narrow trails, each vanishing into the mist. Lucas stopped, his gaze scanning the options before turning to the group. The forest has chosen. Each of you must take a different path. What lies ahead is meant for you alone. What? Split up! Clara's voice wavered. That's madness. Lucas's expression was resolute. The forest tests individuals, not groups. You cannot rely on anyone else. You must rely on yourself. Victor gritted his teeth. Fine, I'll take the left path. Without waiting for a response, he marched forward, his footsteps crunching against the brittle undergrowth. Clara watched him disappear before turning to Lucas. What if we fail? Lucas's voice softened. Failure is not the forest's concern. It seeks truth. Whether you succeed depends on what you carry in your heart. Claire hesitated, then chose the middle path, her face pale but determined. The villagers, exchanging nervous glances, dispersed along the remaining trails, each disappearing into the mist until Lucas was left alone. He stood for a moment, gazing after them, before taking the final path himself. Victor's path was treacherous from the start. The ground beneath his feet turned uneven, roots snaking out to trip him with every step. He cursed under his breath, swatting at the low-hanging branches that clawed at his face. As he pressed on, the mist grew thicker, the trees more oppressive. Then he heard it, a faint, melodic whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. He froze, his heart pounding. Who's there? He called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. The whisper grew louder, resolving into words. Greed consumes. Turn back or be devoured. Victor's jaw tightened. I'm not afraid of some forest trickery. The path opened into a clearing, where a small chest sat atop a moss-covered pedestal. The chest glimmered, its golden surface almost blinding in the dim light. Victor's breath caught. He stepped forward, reaching for the chest, but as his fingers brushed the surface, it burst into flames, the heat searing his skin. A voice boomed around him. Greed blinds you. You see only gold, not the truth. The flames rose higher, and Victor stumbled back, clutching his hand. The chest disappeared, and the clearing dissolved into mist, leaving him alone with the weight of his choices. Clara's path was no less harrowing. The mist thickened as she walked, muffling her footsteps and turning the trees into ghostly silhouettes. She tried to steady her breathing, but her unease grew with every step. "Father," she whispered, startled by the sound of her own voice, "are you here?" The path opened into a scene that made her blood run cold. She stood in her childhood home, the familiar walls now crumbling, the floorboards rotted and broken. In the center of the room sat Ethan, his frail body slumped in a chair, his eyes closed. "Father," she called out, rushing to his side. As she reached for him, his eyes snapped open, and they were filled with sorrow. "Why did you leave me, Clara?" he rasped. "Why did you forget me?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't forget you. I I wanted to come back, but You left me alone," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "You abandoned me for your own gain." The room began to crumble around her, the walls collapsing into darkness. Clara screamed, trying to hold onto the chair, but it turned to ash beneath her fingers. She fell to her knees, sobbing as the voice of the forest echoed around her. "The past cannot be undone. Only through truth can you find redemption." Elsewhere, the villagers faced their own trials. One confronted visions of loved ones accusing them of cowardice. Another was lured by false promises of wealth, only to find themselves lost in an endless loop of paths. Each trial forced them to confront their deepest fears, their darkest secrets, and their truest selves. Lucas's journey was different. The forest parted for him, the mist thinning as he moved with purpose. He came to a clearing where a massive tree stood, its roots burrowed deep into the earth. At its base was a small pool, its waters so still they reflected the sky above. He knelt by the pool, his reflection staring back at him. "You know why I've come," he said aloud. The water rippled, and a voice answered, "You are the guide, but not the savior. Their fate is their own." Lucas nodded, his expression solemn. "I understand." The forest fell silent, the weight of its gaze upon him. He stood, turning back the way he had come, ready to reunite with those who had passed the trials, and those who had not. Hours later, the survivors emerged from the mist, their faces pale and drawn. Victor stumbled out first, his hands blistered, his eyes hollow. Clara followed, her cheeks streaked with tears. Only a handful of villagers returned, their expressions haunted. Lucas was the last to appear, his face calm but unreadable. "You faced yourselves," Lucas said, his voice steady. "Now you understand what the forest demands." Victor sneered. "It's a trick. All of it. There's no treasure, no codex." Lucas's gaze was unwavering. "The codex is not for you." Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "But my father, he's the guardian. Your father has already proven himself?" Lucas interrupted. "This trial was not his. It was yours, and you have seen what lies within your hearts." The group fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them like a shroud. For some, the forest had offered clarity. For others, it had laid bare truths they could not face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and crimson, Lucas turned back toward the village. "Come," he said, "there is still more to learn." And so they followed, the shadow of the forest's trials lingering in their hearts, its lessons etched into their souls. The codex remained hidden, but its wisdom had already begun to take root. As the group emerged from the oppressive shadows of the forest and re-entered the village, a heavy silence clung to them. Faces pale, steps hesitant, they carried the weight of their trials like invisible chains. The once confident Victor now moved with a pronounced limp, his blistered hands hidden in his pockets. Clara, her eyes red from tears, seemed unable to meet anyone's gaze. The villagers who had ventured into the woods were no better. Each wore an expression of quiet torment, as though they had glimpsed a truth they were not ready to accept. Lucas led the group, his stride steady and unyielding. The villagers, who had been watching from the safety of their homes, began to gather in small clusters, murmuring among themselves. News of the expedition into the forest had spread quickly, and the villagers' curiosity was palpable. They had heard the whispers of the Emerald Codex, the ancient artifact that Ethan had supposedly guarded for decades, and now they waited, eager to learn the truth. The group reached Ethan's cottage just as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the village in a warm amber glow. Lucas pushed open the door, and the room fell into stillness. Ethan lay on his bed, his frail body barely rising with each shallow breath. His once sharp eyes flickered open, their light dim but still perceptive. He looked at the faces of those who had returned from the forest, his gaze lingering on Clara and Victor. "You came back," Ethan rasped, his voice no louder than a whisper. Clara stepped forward, her hands trembling. "Father, we pride." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "And what did you find?" Her lips parted, but no words came. The memories of her trial, of the vision of her father's sorrow, flooded her mind, and shame clenched her throat. She lowered her head, unable to answer. Victor, standing stiffly beside her, crossed his arms. "The forest was a trap," he said bitterly. "It showed us lies, illusions. There was nothing there but tricks." Lucas's voice cut through the room, calm but firm. "The forest doesn't deceive. It reveals." Ethan let out a weak chuckle, the sound dry and brittle. "The Codex was never meant for those who seek it out of greed." Victor scowled. "Then what's the point of it? What's the point of any of this?" "The Codex," Ethan said, his voice gaining a hint of strength, "is not treasure. It is wisdom. It doesn't grant riches or power. It grants understanding. Those who seek it with selfish hearts will find only their own reflection staring back at them." Clara's head snapped up, her expression one of despair. "Father, I didn't mean to." Ethan held up a trembling hand, silencing her. "The forest doesn't judge as I do, Clara. It sees the truth of your heart. You cannot lie to it." The room grew quiet, the weight of his words sinking into the hearts of those present. Ethan shifted slightly, his frail body visibly struggling to sustain him. Lucas stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on the older man's shoulder. "Tell them," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell them the truth." Lucas nodded and turned to address the room. "Ethan has been the guardian of the Emerald Codex for over 40 years. He was chosen by the forest for his selflessness, for his ability to see beyond himself. But the role of a guardian is not to possess the Codex. It is to protect it from those who would misuse it." A murmur spread through the gathered villagers. Lucas continued, his voice steady and measured. "Ethan's life has been one of sacrifice. He gave up the comforts of companionship, of wealth, of recognition, all to ensure that the Codex remained safe, not for himself, but for those who might one day need its wisdom." Clara stepped forward again, her voice trembling. "If he's the guardian, then why did he let us go into the forest? Why didn't he stop us?" Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a moment the old fire returned. "Because I needed to know, Clara," he said. "I needed to know if you would choose love over greed, compassion over selfishness. The forest tests us all, and you," he trailed off, his gaze softening, "you weren't ready." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she fell to her knees beside his bed. "I'm sorry, Father. I'm so sorry. I didn't understand." Ethan reached out with a trembling hand, brushing her cheek. "Understanding comes through trials, child. Regret is not the end, it is the beginning." Lucas stepped forward, addressing the room once more. "The Codex remains hidden as it should. Its wisdom is not meant to be wielded by those who seek to control or exploit it. But Ethan has decided that his time as guardian is over. He will pass on his legacy, not to his family, but to those who have shown kindness, compassion, and self." The villagers exchanged uncertain glances. "What does that mean?" one of them asked hesitantly. Lucas smiled faintly. "It means that Ethan's wealth, the wealth he has gathered over decades, the resources he has protected, will not go to those who abandoned him in his time of need. It will go to the ones who cared for him without expecting anything in return." The room erupted in murmurs. Some of the villagers looked ashamed, others relieved. Clara and Victor remained silent, their expressions a mix of guilt and frustration. Ethan, his strength fading rapidly, whispered one last command. "Lucas, bring them here." Lucas nodded and stepped outside, returning moments later with several villagers, those who had brought Ethan food when he was too weak to cook, those who had stopped by to check on him despite the stigma surrounding his name. Among them were an elderly woman with a kind smile, a young boy clutching a small wooden carving, and a man who had helped repair Ethan's roof after a storm. "You showed kindness when there was no reason to," Ethan said, his voice faint but resolute. "You asked for nothing, and yet you gave. That is the heart the forest values. And so I give to you what I have saved, not for myself, but for those who deserve it." Lucas handed out small parcels to each of the villagers, sacks of coins, deeds to parcels of land, and tokens of gratitude. The recipients wept openly, their gratitude overflowing. Their gratitude overflowing. The room was filled with a warmth that seemed to radiate from Ethan himself. As the evening deepened, Ethan's breaths grew shallower. Clara remained by his side, her hands clutching his, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do better, Father," she whispered. "I promise I'll do better." Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes closing. "Then my work is done." As the final rays of sunlight slipped below the horizon, Ethan took one last breath and passed into the silence. The room remained still, the air heavy with grief and reverence. Ethan, the guardian of the Emerald Codex, had fulfilled his purpose. Lucas placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, his voice soft. "Your father has left a legacy not in gold, but in the lessons he taught. Honor it well." The villagers filed out one by one, their hearts heavy but inspired. The Codex remained hidden, its wisdom untouched, but Ethan's sacrifice had planted its seeds. His story, like the forest itself, would endure. In the days following Ethan's passing, Mistwood was cloaked in an unusual stillness. The villagers, once known for their endless whispers and idle gossip, moved with a quiet reverence, as if the forest itself had commanded their silence, Ethan's story, once dismissed as the ramblings of an eccentric hermit, had become a legend, his name spoken with awe and regret. His cottage, once a place of isolation, was now regarded as sacred ground, a reminder of the man who had sacrificed so much for a village that had given him so little. The transformation of Mistwood began subtly, like the first buds of spring after a harsh winter. The villagers who had received Ethan's gifts, coins, land, and tokens of gratitude, used them not for selfish gain, but for the betterment of the community. The elderly woman who had brought Ethan food began using her newfound wealth to open a small bakery, providing bread for those who could not afford it. The young boy with the wooden carving used his share to buy tools, learning the craft of carpentry to repair homes, in disrepair. And the man who had fixed Ethan's roof started a cooperative, teaching others to maintain their homes and the village itself. Ethan's generosity had sown seeds of kindness and cooperation that spread quickly through Mistwood. Where there had once been suspicion and division, there was now unity. The villagers began to see each other not as competitors or strangers, but as neighbors, bound together by a shared story and a renewed sense of purpose. The once abandoned square came alive with activity, market stalls brimming with goods, children playing under the shade of the great oak, and the sound of laughter replacing the murmurs of disdain. The forest, too, seemed to reflect this transformation. Though still cloaked in mystery, its presence no longer felt menacing. Hunters returned with game in abundance, and gatherers found the herbs and roots they needed without fear of losing their way. Some claimed the forest had softened, that its trials had ended with Ethan's passing, while others believed it was simply watching, waiting for the next guardian to emerge. Clara, for her part, had become a shadow of her former self. The once proud woman, whose eyes had been filled with ambition and greed, now walked the village with a humility that seemed foreign to her. She spent her days tending to Ethan's cottage, cleaning and repairing it with her own hands. Though the villagers offered to help, she refused, insisting that it was her burden to bear. She planted flowers in the garden, replaced the cracked window panes, and repainted the worn walls. It was her way of seeking redemption, of honoring the father she had so gravely wronged. Victor, however, had not stayed. The forest had broken something in him that could not be mended. He left Mistwood shortly after Ethan's funeral, his parting words bitter and filled with resentment. "This place holds nothing for me," he had said, his tone sharp. "You can have your codex and your cursed forest." No one stopped him as he disappeared down the winding road, his silhouette swallowed by the mist. For the rest of the village, life flourished. The newfound unity brought with it a sense of hope and resilience. When the crops failed briefly that summer, the villagers pooled their resources, ensuring no family went hungry. When a storm swept through the valley, damaging homes and uprooting trees, they worked together to rebuild, their hands guided by the lessons they had learned from Ethan's legacy. Lucas, who had remained in Mistwood after Ethan's passing, became a quiet yet integral part of the community. Though he rarely spoke of the Codex or the trials of the forest, he often shared wisdom that seemed to echo Ethan's own. He helped the villagers understand that true wealth was not found in gold or treasure, but in the bonds they shared, the kindness they extended, and the strength they found in unity. One evening, Lucas gathered the villagers in the square, standing beneath the great oak as the sun dipped low in the sky. "Ethan's story is now part of this village," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But stories are not just to be told, they are to be lived." He showed us that kindness can transform even the coldest hearts, that sacrifice can build a future for those who come after us. What will you do with this legacy? The question hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, the villagers began to speak. A farmer offered to share his harvest with those in need. A weaver volunteered to teach her craft to the children. The blacksmith pledged to repair tools for free during the winter. Each voice added to the chorus, a testament to the change that had taken root in Mistwood. Clara, who had been standing at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. Her hands were calloused from weeks of labor, her face lined with the strain of guilt and regret. "I want to honor my father," she said, her voice trembling, not with words but with actions. "He gave his life for this village. It's time I did the same." The villagers, moved by her sincerity, nodded in agreement. Though her past actions could not be undone, they saw in her a genuine desire to make amends. She began working alongside the others, her hands no longer idle, her heart no longer consumed by greed. Slowly but surely, she found her place in the community, her name no longer spoken with disdain, but with a cautious respect. As the seasons turned, Mistwood grew into a beacon of hope for the surrounding region. Travelers passing through remarked on the village's warmth and generosity, its resilience in the face of hardship. Stories of Ethan's sacrifice spread beyond the valley, inspiring others to reflect on their own lives, their own choices. The Emerald Codex, though still hidden, had already begun to fulfill its purpose, not through direct revelation, but through the wisdom and compassion it had inspired in those who had come close to it. The great oak in the village square became a symbol of this transformation. Beneath its wide, sheltering branches, the villagers gathered to share meals, celebrate festivals, and tell stories. And among those stories, Ethan's tale was told again and again, each retelling a reminder of the man who had given everything to protect a truth that could not be bought or sold. Lucas, ever watchful, knew that the Codex had chosen wisely in Ethan. Though the artifact remained a mystery to most, its influence was undeniable. It had planted a seed in Mistwood, and that seed had grown into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The village, once divided by suspicion and greed, now stood united. It was no longer just a collection of homes scattered along the forest edge. It was a community bound together by love, sacrifice, and the enduring memory of a man who had understood the true meaning of wealth. The day of Ethan's farewell arrived, marked by a quiet solemnity that settled over Mistwood like the morning mist. Though his physical departure had already passed, this was the day the village chose to honor his life, his sacrifices, and the legacy he had left behind. The villagers, now bound together by the profound changes Ethan had inspired, had prepared tirelessly for the occasion. It was not a funeral, nor a festival, but something in between, a gathering of remembrance and renewal. At the center of the village square, beneath the sprawling branches of the great oak, a simple wooden altar had been built. It bore carvings of the symbols Ethan had etched into his works, intricate patterns of vines, stars, and swirling lines that seemed to tell a story only the forest truly understood. On the altar rested a small box, crafted from the finest wood Ethan had ever worked with. Inside were the few possessions he had left behind: a small carving knife, a tattered journal filled with sketches, and a locket containing a faded picture of a woman none had ever seen. The villagers began gathering at dawn, their faces solemn but peaceful. They came not out of obligation but gratitude, each carrying something to offer in his memory. A young boy brought a carving he had made under Ethan's guidance, the lines uneven but full of effort. The baker carried a loaf of bread, its crust golden and warm, a symbol of the meal she had shared with him in his final days. Others brought flowers, candles, and tokens of kindness, laying them gently around the altar. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands clutching a simple bouquet of wildflowers. She had been silent throughout the preparations, working tirelessly alongside the villagers, but saying little. Her face bore the weight of regret, but her eyes held a quiet determination. She had vowed to honor her father, not with words, but actions. And this day was the first true test of that promise. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden rays through the leaves of the oak, Lucas stepped forward. He wore no special robes, no symbols of authority, yet his presence commanded attention. The villagers fell silent as he began to speak. Ethan was a man of few words, Lucas said, his voice steady and resonant. He lived in the shadows not because he was afraid, but because he understood that light is best shared by those who seek it, not those who hoard it. He gave us not wealth or power, but something far greater, the understanding that true strength lies in kindness, in humility, and in the quiet, courage to protect what matters most. He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. Each of you here today has been touched by his legacy. You have seen the changes he inspired in this village, not through force, but through example. He taught us that the greatest treasures are not found in gold or jewels, but in the bonds we share, the sacrifices we make, and the love we give freely. Lucas turned to Clara, who stood frozen, her bouquet trembling in her hands, and he taught us that it is never too late to change. Lucas continued, his gaze soft but unwavering, that redemption is not a gift given by others, but a path we choose for ourselves. The villagers turned to look at Clara, their expressions a mix of curiosity and encouragement. Slowly she stepped forward, her footsteps hesitant but purposeful. Reaching the altar, she placed the bouquet among the other offerings, her hands lingering as she spoke. My father was not an easy man to understand, she began, her voice trembling. For so long I didn't try. I saw him as weak, as small because I was too blinded by my own ambitions to see the truth. I mocked him, abandoned him, and I failed him, and I... Tears streamed down her face, but she did not falter. But even after all I did, he never stopped loving me. He never stopped hoping that I could be better. And now I see him for who he truly was, a man stronger and wiser than I could have ever imagined, a man who gave his life so that others could find theirs. She stepped back, her words hanging in the air like a prayer. The villagers, moved by her honesty, nodded in silent agreement. They had seen the changes in Clara, the way she had worked tirelessly to repair the damage she had done, and they knew her sorrow was genuine. Lucas stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Ethan's story does not end here. It lives on in each of us, in the choices we make and the lives we touch. Let us honor him not with tears, but with action, by continuing the work he began and ensuring that his sacrifice was not in vain. With that, he gestured to the altar where a single candle had been lit. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, lighting their own candles from its flame and placing them around the altar. The soft glow spread, illuminating the square with a warm golden light. It was as if the village itself had come alive, each flickering flame a testament to Ethan's enduring legacy. As the final candle was placed, a gust of wind swept through the square, rustling the leaves of the great oak and carrying with it a sound that could have been the whisper of the forest. The villagers stood in silence, their faces turned upward, as if listening for something beyond the reach of human ears. When the wind died down, Lucas spoke one last time. The forest has given us many gifts, but none greater than the lessons Ethan shared. Let us carry those lessons forward, not just carry those lessons forward, not just today, but always. The crowd began to disperse, the villagers returning to their homes with a renewed sense of purpose. Clara remained by the altar, her hands resting on the edge as she gazed at her father's belongings. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Lucas standing beside her. "He was proud of you," Lucas said softly, "even when you couldn't see it." Clara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'll make him prouder." Lucas smiled faintly. "You already have." As the sun set, casting the square in hues of amber and crimson, Clara lit one final candle and placed it at the center of the altar. The flame flickered brightly, its light reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. She stood there for a long time, her heart heavy but resolute, as the villagers' laughter and the distant rustle of the forest wove together into a harmony that felt almost like a blessing. Ethan was gone, but his spirit lingered, woven into the fabric of the village he had loved so deeply. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Mistwood began to heal, one flickering flame at a time. Thank you so much for staying until the end of this story. It means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Your support keeps these tales alive, and we'd love for you to join us on this journey. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story. Together, let's keep the magic of storytelling alive. See you in the next one.